The private jet terminal was a world of its own, a sanctuary for the elite, where delays were unheard of and exclusivity reigned supreme. The air carried the faint scent of leather and expensive cologne, mingling with the hum of soft jazz playing over the speakers. Plush chairs lined the lounge, occupied by individuals who moved through life with an effortless sense of entitlement. Among them sat Preston Hawthorne, a man who had never heard the word no in his life. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that cost more than most people's yearly salary, he scrolled through his phone with the same detached confidence he used when making million-dollar deals. Everything was a transaction to him: money, people, power. And if there was one universal truth he had come to rely on, it was this: everyone has a price. Tonight was no different. He had planned to board his private jet at his leisure, expecting the world to adjust to his schedule as it always did. But when his assistant, a nervous man who lived in constant fear of disappointing him, stammered out the unexpected news, Preston barely looked up. "The jet is full, sir." Preston exhaled sharply through his nose, unimpressed. "Then get someone off," he said, not bothering to pause his scrolling. His assistant swallowed hard. "It's not that simple, sir. The manifest is locked and—" Preston's head finally lifted, his expression turning cold. "You think I care about the manifest?" His voice was calm, measured, but laced with the kind of quiet threat that made people scramble to obey. "Make a call. Offer them something. Everyone has a number." His assistant hesitated only for a fraction of a second before nodding and scurrying off, phone already pressed to his ear. Preston leaned back in his chair, unfazed. This wasn't an issue. It was an inconvenience, an irritation at best. He had bought out entire hotels before just to avoid standing in line. This would be no different. His gaze drifted across the room, scanning the other passengers waiting to board. A few familiar faces. A hedge fund manager who had been groveling for an investment last week, a fashion mogul pretending not to notice him, a couple of old money types sipping on overpriced whiskey. No one important. And then his eyes landed on a man sitting alone in the corner. There was nothing remarkable about him, not in the way Preston was used to identifying status. No Rolex flashing under the soft lighting, no designer labels, no desperate attempts to be noticed. A black hoodie, jeans, and a worn-out duffel bag sat beside him. He looked like someone who had stumbled into the wrong place. Preston smirked. Perfect. This was the kind of person who could be bought out easily. Probably someone flying on a last-minute upgrade, overwhelmed by the luxury, completely out of his element. Preston had dealt with men like this before, people who mistook proximity to wealth for belonging. His assistant returned, looking paler than before. "Sir, no one is willing to give up their seat." Preston's expression barely shifted. "Then they weren't offered enough." The assistant hesitated, then cleared his throat. "There's one passenger left to ask." He nodded toward the man in the hoodie, the one Preston had already singled out. Preston's smirk widened. This was going to be easy. He stood buttoning his jacket with a kind of effortless grace that came from years of knowing the world bent to his will. With long, confident strides, he made his way across the lounge, the weight of his presence turning a few heads as he passed. By the time he reached the man's table, Preston had already decided the outcome. "Excuse me," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with the same charm he used to close deals. "I'd like to make you an offer." The man looked up, his expression unreadable. His dark eyes were calm, steady, completely unaffected by the presence of a billionaire standing over him. Preston wasn't used to that, but it didn't matter. Everyone had a price, and he was about to name his Keanu Reeves, had never been one to demand attention. It was almost an art, the way he could fade into the background, despite being one of the most recognizable faces in the world. He had mastered the rare ability to exist in a space without claiming it, moving through life with the quiet ease of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. And so, there he sat, alone in the sleek, high-end private jet terminal, his worn-out duffel bag resting beside him. A book open in his hands. The world around him moved at a different frequency. A hum of power, status, and silent competition. The men and women sipping their expensive whiskey and exchanging subtle glances of recognition didn't notice him. They were too busy calculating who among them mattered the most. Keanu, as always, didn't care. He had booked his seat on the private jet without fuss, without ego. It was a simple necessity, a means of getting from one place to another. No assistants handling his luggage, no security detail clearing the way. Just him, his book, and a rare moment of solitude before another inevitable stretch of work. Occasionally, a passing staff member would do a double take, eyes widening slightly as they recognized him. But when they realized he wasn't the type to demand special treatment or bask in recognition, they left him alone. He preferred it that way. Across the room, the energy was different. He could feel it, even without looking up. Some men carried their wealth like a weapon, a constant need to assert dominance over everything around them. They spoke loudly, laughed just a little too forcefully, their watches and tailored suits a silent declaration of superiority. Keanu had seen men like that before, many times, and one of them, he could tell, was watching him now. He didn't lift his eyes from the book, but he didn't need to. He could feel the presence approaching, a kind of entitled gravity pulling closer, the unmistakable weight of someone who expected the world to rearrange itself for them. Then, a voice. "Excuse me." Keanu finally looked up. The man standing before him was exactly the type he had expected. Mid-50s, sharp suit, slicked back hair that had seen more products than care. His smile was polished, practiced, the kind of smile that closed deals, not friendships. Keanu had met countless people like this before. Men who didn't ask, they instructed who suggest, they assumed. The stranger extended a hand, but not in greeting, not in respect, in ownership. "I'd like to make you an offer." Keanu glanced at the outstretched hand, then back up at the man's face. He didn't take it. The man's smile faltered for half a second, so brief, so imperceptible that only someone paying close attention would have caught it. Keanu was paying attention. He exhaled softly, closing his book with careful precision, the way one does when they know something interesting is about to happen. "An offer?" Keanu echoed, tilting his head slightly, his voice calm, easy, amused. The man straightened his shoulders, confident again, the momentary misstep forgotten. "Yes," he said smoothly. "I'd like to buy your seat." Keanu blinked. Of course. That explained everything. Keanu wasn't the first person this man had approached. That much was obvious. This was a pattern, a routine negotiation. The man wanted something, so naturally he assumed it was for sale. Keanu studied him for a moment, noting the expectant way the man held himself, as if he had already decided how this would go. He had no idea. Keanu leaned back slightly, the smallest of smiles touching his lips. "I appreciate the offer," he said simply, "but I'm good where I am." And just like that, the game the man thought he was playing was over before it even started. Preston Hawthorne had never met a problem that money couldn't solve. To him, the world was a game of transactions, a place where everything and everyone had a price. So when he was told that the private jet was fully booked, he barely reacted. Seated at the edge of the terminal lounge, he took a slow sip of his whiskey, letting the warmth settle in his chest. He didn't rush, he didn't panic. He simply set the glass down and adjusted his cufflinks before motioning for his assistant. The nervous man hurried over, phone still in hand. Preston barely glanced at him before speaking. "I assume you fixed it." His assistant hesitated, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Sir, I tried, but..." Preston let out a slow sigh, his patience thinning. "You tried?" He turned his gaze up, pinning the man with a stare that had made CEOs crumble under pressure. "You don't try. You do." The assistant swallowed hard. "The staff says there are no available seats. Everyone is already confirmed. They can't..." Preston scoffed. "They can't?" His voice was calm, laced with amusement. How quaint. The idea that some low-level airline staffer thought they could tell him what was and wasn't possible. He stood, adjusting the jacket of his custom-tailored suit before walking toward the check-in counter. Heads turned as he moved. They always did. His presence commanded attention, his aura exuding the kind of confidence that came from knowing the world bent to his will. The woman behind the counter straightened at his approach, her professional demeanor slipping just slightly under the weight of his intense gaze. "I understand there's been a mistake," Preston said smoothly, offering her a practiced smile. "I need a seat on that jet." The woman hesitated. "I'm very sorry, sir, but..." "No, you're not." he cut in, his tone polite but firm, because if you were, you'd be fixing it instead of making excuses. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice as if offering her a lifeline. Let's not make this complicated. I'll pay whatever's necessary. She swallowed, shifting her stance. Sir, I really do apologize, but the manifest is locked. The only way a seat can open is if a passenger voluntarily gives theirs up. Preston arched a brow. That was all? Easy. His gaze flicked over to the clipboard resting on the counter, where a list of names was printed in neat rows. He didn't recognize most of them, but that didn't matter. What's the name of the passenger in the last seat? He asked. The woman hesitated. He smiled again, slow and deliberate. That wasn't a rhetorical question. She faltered, then, as if realizing this was not a man you refused, glanced over the list. After a pause, she took a careful breath. That seat, she said quietly, belongs to Mr. Reeves. Preston frowned slightly. The name meant nothing to him. Probably some tech millionaire or minor celebrity who had gotten lucky. Irrelevant. Perfect, he said smoothly, his confidence unwavering. The woman blinked. Excuse me? Preston smirked, his next move already fully calculated. I'll take care of it myself. And with that he turned, eyes locking onto the quiet man in the black hoodie, sitting alone in the corner, flipping a page in his book. Preston had already won. He just needed to name the price. Preston Hawthorne didn't waste time with small talk. He never needed to. Deals were made in numbers, not words, and he had perfected the art of making people say yes before they even realized they had a choice. As he strode toward the man in the black hoodie, he barely registered the few passengers still lingering in the lounge. They weren't important. What mattered was getting what he wanted. He stopped in front of the table, hands in his pockets, wearing the calculated smirk that had closed million-dollar deals before lunch. The man, Reeves, was it? Didn't even look up at first, still flipping a page in his book, seemingly unaware that the most powerful man in the room was now standing over him. Preston hated being ignored. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. "I hear you've got a seat on the jet." Keanu glanced up, dark eyes calm. "Yeah." Preston flashed a knowing smile. "I need it." There was no arrogance in Keanu's expression, no ego, no panic, none of the usual nervous shifting Preston had come to expect when people realized who they were dealing with. "Just quiet amusement," Preston continued, unbothered. "I don't expect you to give it up for free, of course." He reached into his jacket, pulling out his sleek black wallet and slipping a black metal card between his fingers. "How does 200,000 sound?" Keanu blinked, tilting his head slightly. "For what?" Preston chuckled, as if the question was ridiculous. "For your seat, obviously." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then Keanu grinned. Not in the way most people did around Preston. Not eager, not nervous, not overwhelmed, just amused. Like this was nothing more than a mildly interesting interaction. Preston's smirk faltered. He didn't like uncertainty. Keanu exhaled softly, then leaned back in his chair. "I appreciate the offer," he said casually, "but I think I'll keep my seat." Preston blinked. There was no hesitation in Keanu's voice, no negotiation, just a simple, calm rejection. It took a second for Preston to process what had just happened. No one said no to him, especially not when there was money on the table. His smile returned, tighter this time. "All right," he said, as if humoring a child. "I get it. You're playing the long game." He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, then turned it around, showing the display. $500,000. "I'll wire it right now," Preston said, voice dripping with confidence. "Just say the word." Keanu's gaze flicked to the phone, then back to Preston. He didn't even blink. "I'm good," he said, simply. Preston let out a soft laugh of disbelief. This was getting ridiculous. "All right, listen," he said, leaning in slightly. "I don't know if you understand how these things work, but everything has a price. You have a price." Keanu shrugged, unbothered. "Not really." Preston's jaw tightened. This was supposed to be easy. A nobody sitting alone in a private jet lounge, a quick exchange of money, a handshake, and the problem would be solved. And yet this guy wasn't playing along. Fine, if logic wasn't working, he'd go for the kill shot. "You're sitting on a gold mine," Preston said, leaning in slightly. "You don't belong here. I don't know how you got that seat, but I can guarantee it's the best deal you'll ever get. Take the money, get yourself a first-class commercial ticket, and you still walk away $500,000 richer." He smiled again, waiting for the inevitable cave. Keanu didn't cave. Instead, he just gave a small, lazy shrug. "Appreciate the offer," he said, flipping his book back open, "but I'll pass." Preston stared at him. What the hell was happening? He had just offered $500,000, more than what most people made in a year, for a seat, and this guy? This guy had just shrugged it off like he was turning down a free coffee? Preston straightened, slipping his phone back into his pocket, his expression darkening. "All right," he said, his tone dropping. "Let's stop wasting time. Name your price." Keanu finally looked up again, closing the book slowly. There was something in his eyes now, not arrogance, not smugness, something quieter, something steady. He didn't flinch, didn't waver, didn't even hesitate. "I'm not for sale." Preston froze. For the first time in his life, he had no idea what to say. Preston Hawthorne had faced negotiations before. High-stakes boardroom deals, multi-million-dollar acquisitions, hostile takeovers where fortunes were won and lost. But he had never, not once, been met with a simple, calm rejection. And certainly not over something as trivial as a seat on a jet. The lounge had gone eerily quiet. A few guests who had previously been lost in their own conversations had now shifted their attention entirely to the unfolding scene. Private jet terminals weren't known for their public spectacles. But tonight, something was happening that no one wanted to miss. Preston let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if Keanu were an amusing curiosity, a joke he had yet to fully understand. "I don't think you get it," he said, his voice dipping into condescension. "I'm offering you the kind of deal people dream about." He leaned forward, smiling just enough to make it look like an act of generosity rather than desperation. "Take the money. Enjoy yourself. Hell, take a vacation. Whatever you want." Keanu didn't even blink. "No, thank you." That was it. 2 words. Casual, polite, unbothered, and yet they landed harder than a slammed door to the face. Preston's smirk flickered. His mind worked quickly, shifting strategies. If money didn't work, maybe intimidation would. His eyes flicked over Keanu's outfit. The black hoodie, the worn jeans, the duffel bag that looked like it had seen better days. "You sure about that, buddy?" he said, his voice a shade colder. He motioned vaguely to Keanu's clothes. "I mean, look at you. You don't exactly fit in here. Private jets aren't exactly for people like you." Keanu exhaled softly, the ghost of a smile on his lips. Not angry, not offended. Just watching Preston, encouraged by what he assumed was hesitation, pressed on. "I'll be honest, man," he continued, voice lowering like he was letting Keanu in on some secret. "This is the best deal you're gonna get. I don't know how you ended up with that seat. Maybe some business associate pulled a favor. Maybe you saved up for this one big moment. But let's be real." He leaned in slightly. "You can't actually afford to be here." There it was. The final push. The moment Preston expected Keanu to cave, to admit defeat, to take the money and leave quietly. But Keanu's expression didn't change. Instead, he let out a soft laugh. It wasn't forced, it wasn't defensive, it was genuine. Then he leaned back in his chair and tilted his head, his voice calm. That's interesting," he mused, "because you seem a lot more desperate to take my seat than I am to sell it." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Preston's smirk vanished. The lounge was silent. Eyes flicked between them, guests now openly watching. Even the airline staff had stopped what they were doing, pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. Keanu wasn't nervous. He wasn't intimidated, and Preston hated it. No one had ever spoken to him like that. His jaw tightened. That should have been over. He should have won. And yet, here he was, standing in a room full of people, looking less like the powerful billionaire he had built himself up to be, and more like the guy who had just lost a battle he didn't even understand. Keanu simply opened his book again, as if this conversation had already ended. And for the first time in his life, Preston had no idea what to do next. The silence in the lounge had taken on a new weight, a thick, uneasy kind of stillness that Preston wasn't used to. It wasn't the silence of people waiting for a deal to be made, it was something else entirely. He could feel it now. A shift. A few quiet whispers had started among the other passengers. Murmurs passed between curious onlookers. Heads turned, eyes widened. Some people stared outright, their expressions a mix of amusement and disbelief, Preston noticed, but he didn't understand. Not yet. His focus remained locked on the man in front of him, the same nobody in a hoodie who had somehow just embarrassed him in front of the entire lounge. And Preston Hawthorne didn't do humiliation grinding his teeth. He shoved his hands back into his pockets, forcing his voice to remain steady, calm, in control. "Look," he said, exhaling sharply, as if he were the one being patient here. "I don't know what kind of stunt you're trying to pull, but I'm giving you a chance to—" Then a voice from the other side of the room cut in, casual, amused. "Dude, does he not know?" Preston's words stalled. He flicked his gaze toward the speaker, a younger guy dressed in a designer jacket sitting a few seats away. The guy was leaning back, one eyebrow raised, watching Preston like he was watching someone walk into traffic without realizing it. Preston narrowed his eyes. "Know what?" The younger man smirked, shaking his head. "Oh man, you really don't know." More whispers rippled through the lounge. A few guests glanced at each other, some covering their mouths to stifle laughs. Even the airline's staff, who had spent the last 20 minutes avoiding eye contact, were suddenly fascinated by their paperwork. Preston's patience snapped. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded. That's when an older gentleman sitting near the bar let out a small chuckle. He swirled the whiskey in his glass before glancing up, finally taking pity on him. "Son," he said, shaking his head, "you're trying to buy a seat from Keanu Reeves." "As in Keanu Reeves?" He turned back toward the man sitting in front of him, the same man he had tried to belittle, the one he had just lectured about not belonging here, and suddenly he saw it. The familiarity in his face, the way everyone else in the room had recognized him before he did, the reason why he had been so calm. Preston's mouth went dry. No way. Keanu had already gone back to his book, completely unfazed, as if this wasn't the first time someone had made a complete fool of themselves in front of him. And Preston, he had just done it in front of a room full of people. The shift was complete. All eyes were on him now. And for the first time in his life, Preston Hawthorne wasn't the most powerful man in the room. Preston Hawthorne had never known the feeling of being powerless, until now. The realization settled in his chest like a lead weight, pressing down with unbearable force. Keanu Reeves. The Keanu Reeves, the man he had just talked down to, the man he had mocked for not belonging, the man he had tried to buy off like a disposable extra in his own life story, was one of the most respected, beloved, and admired figures in the world. And now the entire lounge was watching him unravel. He could feel it. The judgment, the quiet shift in energy that no amount of money could fix. A few moments ago, he had commanded the room, a billionaire flexing his power, throwing around numbers that would make most people's heads spin. And now? Now he was the punchline. People weren't whispering in admiration anymore. They weren't awed by his wealth. They weren't impressed by his status, his influence, his name. They were laughing at him. His entire body went rigid as a low murmur of amusement rippled through the room. A few people shook their heads, muttering things under their breath. The younger guy from earlier, the one who had first realized the truth, was full-on grinning now. Preston clenched his jaw. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was the one who won negotiations. He was the one who walked into a room and made other people feel small. But here he was, standing before a man who had just effortlessly dismantled his entire sense of power without raising his voice, without bragging, without even trying. Keanu, for his part, still hadn't reacted. That was the worst part. There was no smugness, no gloating. He hadn't even put his book down. Preston had embarrassed himself in front of an entire crowd, and Keanu hadn't even needed to acknowledge it for it to sting. Because Keanu didn't care, and that indifference was something Preston wasn't used to. His whole world revolved around power plays, around winning, But what do you do when the person you're trying to compete with isn't even playing the game? He swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat tightening. His hands curled into fists at his sides. But what was there to do? Try to recover? Make some kind of joke? Offer even more money? It didn't matter. He had already lost. And worse, the whole world was about to know it. Preston Hawthorne had always believed that money was the ultimate power, the one thing that could open any door, silence any critic, and bend the world to his will. But in this moment, standing before Keanu Reeves, the weight of his arrogance fully sinking in, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Small, the lounge had gone completely silent now, every eye fixed on the unfolding scene, waiting for his response. But Keanu wasn't gloating. He wasn't smirking. Wasn't leaning back with some kind of self-satisfied expression like so many of the corporate sharks Preston had tangled with before. Instead, he did something far worse. He simply shrugged. Like none of this had ever been a big deal to begin with. Like Preston's money, his power, his status, none of it mattered. Then, in the same calm, unbothered tone he had used the entire time, Keanu offered him a lesson he hadn't asked for. Not everything is for sale. Preston froze. The words, so simple yet so absolute, landed with a force that no amount of money could soften. But Keanu wasn't finished. And not everything is about money. A few quiet gasps passed through the room. Someone near the bar exhaled a soft chuckle of disbelief. Even the airline staff, who had been doing their best to pretend they weren't watching, exchanged glances, eyes wide. Preston felt something burning under his skin. Humiliation. He was used to winning, to controlling the room, to never being the fool. But right now he was the fool. And Keanu, the man he had dismissed as irrelevant, as someone who didn't belong in a world of wealth and exclusivity, had just proven that true power had nothing to do with money. Preston wanted to say something. Anything, a comeback, a retort, a way to flip this moment back in his favor, but nothing came. Because what could he say? Keanu hadn't insulted him, he hadn't mocked him, hadn't ridiculed him, hadn't done anything except tell him the truth. And somehow that was worse. The lounge held its breath, watching, waiting. Would Preston fight back? Would he try to buy his way out of this? Or would he finally, for once in his life, realize that he had already lost? Preston Hawthorne stood there, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him, and for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. No witty remark, no power move, no check to write. Nothing the weight of Keanu's words. So simple, yet devastatingly effective. Hung in the air like an unshakable truth. Not everything is for sale, and not everything is about money. Preston had spent his entire life believing otherwise. Money had always been the answer. More than that, it had been his identity. It had opened every door, erased every mistake, and bent people to his will. But now it had failed him. And the worst part, no one cared. The room, which had once been his audience, had already moved on. Keanu, without another word, had already returned to his book, flipping the page like Preston had never even been there. And the others, the ones who had once hung on Preston's every word, who had once admired his wealth, envied his power, they weren't looking at him anymore. In fact, they were avoiding his gaze entirely. A slow, painful realization began to settle in. Preston had always thought that power meant being the center of attention, that status was measured by how many people listened when you spoke. But standing there, feeling completely invisible, he understood something he never had before. True power didn't come from wealth, it came from respect, and respect was something money couldn't buy. He swallowed hard, his fingers twitching at his sides, waiting for something, anything, to shift, waiting for someone to acknowledge him, to break the unbearable silence, to give him an exit from the humiliation, but no one did. A soft murmur of conversation had started up again, but it was no longer about him. The moment had passed, and Preston, a billionaire, a man who had spent his entire life making sure the world noticed him, had never felt so insignificant. The final boarding call echoed through the private jet terminal, breaking through the tense silence that had settled over the room. The staff moved with quiet efficiency, checking tickets, confirming final details, ushering passengers toward the sleek aircraft waiting outside. Preston Hawthorne didn't move. He couldn't. For the first time in his life, his money was useless. His private jet seat, the one he had assumed was his by right, the one he had tried to buy, then demand, then steal with arrogance alone, was never his to claim. And now it was time to board, and he had nowhere to go. Keanu Reeves stood, adjusting the strap of his worn duffel bag, his movements effortless, unhurried. He didn't need to flaunt his wealth, didn't need to remind anyone of who he was. He simply handed his ticket to the attendant, nodded politely, and walked toward the gate. There was no fanfare, no ego, just a man who knew exactly who he was. And as he stepped through the glass doors, disappearing down the jet bridge, Preston felt a sharp pang of something he hadn't felt in years: regret. Not for the money he had lost, because he hadn't lost a dime. Not for the seat, because it had never truly mattered. But for something much worse, for what the entire room now saw him as: a man who thought wealth made him untouchable, a man who believed everything had a price, a man who had been proven wrong, publicly, humiliatingly, by someone who never even tried to fight him. Preston clenched his jaw, shoving his hands into his pockets, his fingers curling into fists. He could feel the eyes on him still, not with admiration, not with envy, but with something far worse: pity. The soft hum of conversation picked up again, but this time it wasn't the empty, meaningless chatter of the wealthy. It was people talking about Keanu, his humility, his patience, his refusal to be bought no matter how high the offer. They weren't laughing at him, they weren't mocking him. They were admiring him. And Preston was already forgotten as the glass doors slid shut behind Keanu. The jet engines roared to life. The aircraft moved smoothly down the runway, picking up speed before lifting into the air, disappearing into the night sky. And Preston Hawthorne? He remained exactly where he was, stranded, powerless, and for the first time in his life, forced to confront the true price of his own arrogance.